Well, let's get started. This is class number 2 to answer to Job. And our assignment tonight consists of 3 different parts. The prefatory note, and then the lectare benevolo, and thirdly, the book of Job that I asked you to reread. So I want to take up each of those 3 parts in turn and make some remarks about each one. Let's start with the prefatory note. Young tells us in this note that the occasion for writing Answer to Job, put in a nutshell, was his encounter with the problem of the opposites. And he tells us that this problem presented itself to him in 2 different areas. The first area was the opposites in the Christian God image that he'd been working on in Ion, and the second area are the opposites as they're encountered in alchemy. He says the most immediate cause of my writing the book is perhaps to be found in certain problems discussed in my book Ion, especially the problems of Christ as a symbolic figure and of the antagonism Christ-Antichrist represented in the traditional zodiacal symbolism of the 2 fishes. He then goes on to speak about criticizing the idea of the privatio boni, psychological experience showing that whatever we call good is balanced by an equally substantial bad or evil, so that the opposites engaged him in that issue. And as a kind of corollary to his encounter with the opposites in the Christian God image, he makes the interesting remark that this crucial question of whence evil, which is due to the fact that later Christianity is dualistic, since it splits off one half of the opposites personified in Satan. He's eternal in a state of damnation. And this crucial question of whence evil forms the point of departure for the Christian theory of redemption. And what he means by that is that the Christian theory of redemption posits the source of evil to reside in man. Man's the source of evil, and therefore man is in need of redemption. That's the point of departure for the Christian theory of redemption. It locates evil in man, practically speaking, but then theologically speaking, it locates evil in the hypostasized figure of Satan, so that you've got a double message there, an ambiguous double message that has never been faced squarely until Jung faces it in this book. So that's his encounter of the opposites in the Christian God image. And he says the other place that he encounters the opposites is in alchemy, because he goes on to say, the study of medieval natural philosophy, that's alchemy, of the greatest importance to psychology, made me try to find an answer to the question, what image of God did these old philosophers have? Or rather, how should the symbols that supplement their image of God be understood? All of this pointed to a complexio oppositorum, and thus recalled again the story of Job to my mind. Job, who expected help from God against God. This most peculiar fact presupposes a similar conception of the opposites in God. You see, his basic concern is dealing with the psychological problem of the opposites. And I'd remind you that at the same time that he wrote Answer to Job, he was putting Mysterium Conjunctionis together. That wasn't published until 1955, but it was being worked on over a 10-year period. So that, as he says in Mysterium Conjunctionis, actually, that the Answer to Job is a kind of appendage to that work, as well as being a kind of sequel to Ion. It runs as part of the same fabric of both those works. Finally, I want to mention the remark about the style of writing that he uses to Answer to Job. He says here, I was gripped by the urgency and difficulty of the problem and was unable to throw it off. Therefore, I found myself obliged to deal with the whole problem, and I did so in the form of describing a personal experience carried by subjective emotions. I deliberately chose this form because I wanted to avoid the impression that I had any idea of announcing an, quote, eternal truth, end quote. I understand that remark to mean that he very carefully and explicitly wrote this material out of his human wholeness. And it's my view that talking about this kind of material, which is really very dangerous to talk about, because it's so easy to fall into an inflation, that this is an example of Jung's canniness in dealing with the unconscious, that he comes to this material out of his full human wholeness, and thus avoids the danger of inflation, which will otherwise happen whenever one starts touching this highly numinous material. You see, throughout he writes with absolute humanness. He doesn't write abstractly at all, and the earthy colloquial speech is part of the protection against inflation, because it's very dangerous to talk about this level of material. Okay, going now to our second category of our assignment tonight. That we come to what's entitled the Lectori Benevola, which means to the kind reader. In this phrase, Jung is asking for the indulgence of the reader that he knows he's about to offend. He's approaching us with elaborate courtesy because he knows he's going to stir up rhinoceros-like affects. As he tells us in another place, wild animals like the rhinoceros don't like to be surprised, so they should be treated with elaborate courtesy. And that's how I understand that particular term. Dear reader, dear kind reader. He's asking for our kindness in view of what the offense he's going to offer. Because as soon as you begin to look into the material in this book earnestly, you're going to realize that it's going to offend almost everybody. And if you're not offended, you probably aren't understanding what he's saying. Either one will be offended that Jung contradicts the familiar God image that one cherishes in one's own religious confession or formulation. Either that, or if one is a secular rationalist, he will be offended that Jung takes so seriously the primitive anthropomorphic God image that rationalists have long since discredited. One or the other is going to offend you, and it's quite possible that you can have both levels of offenses at the same time. So I urge all of you to admit it. You're annoyed. I know when I first read Answer to Job, when it came out in English translation in the 50s, what offended me was how seriously he took this Old Testament God image, expecting something from him. In other words, I had the rationalist position that thought, grow up, Jung. Don't you realize that you mustn't expect justice? The world doesn't like that. In other words, it was a kind of a cynical, stoical, rationalistic type attitude towards the world. That was how I initially experienced my offense. And I think each of you should ask yourself, how are you offended? Because if you locate how you're offended, it will tell you something about the nature of your own unconscious assumptions, and that can be a valuable bit of self-knowledge. Next comes the motto. Now, in the German original of Answer to Job, this motto was put in the Latin of the Vulgate, which I put up here. And that is not accurately translated by the authorized version passage that Hull has put in here. The actual translation should read, I grieve for you, my brother. not distressed. I grieve, because he's grieving over a brother's death. This isn't just a matter of being distressed. It's a matter of experiencing dolio. The word condolence reveals that meaning. Dolio means to grieve, to suffer a loss. And I think it's highly significant, the background that this quotation comes from. The remark is said by David concerning his dear friend Jonathan. Jonathan, who was the son of King Saul, had just died in a battle with the Philistines, along with his father. They had both perished in that same battle. And David is singing an elegy to them, and in which are these lines, "O Jonathan, in your death I am stricken. I grieve for you, Jonathan, my brother." Now, we have to remember that this motto is directed at the kind reader. Namely, it's directed at us, we who are reading it. And he's saying, I grieve for you, my brother, who's about to read this work. Now, those of you who attended the Old Testament course will remember the discussion of King Saul and King David. Saul was the first king of Israel, and although the Spirit of Yahweh was with him initially, it turned negative and destroyed him. David was the second king of Israel, and the Spirit of Yahweh, which abandoned Saul, entered David, and he then had a successful reign. Now, Jonathan was the son of Saul, but he was a loyal friend to David, even though David was destined to replace him as the king's successor. Nonetheless, Jonathan was his beloved loyal friend. So this was a moment of momentous transition between the reign of King Saul and the reign of King David. And I spoke of these two kings as representing Saul is representing the first stage ego, and David is representing the second stage ego. Second stage ego with the right relation to the self. And Jonathan, the son of Saul, was caught between conflicting loyalties. He felt loyalty to his father Saul on the one hand, and to the king to be David on the other hand. But he was not able to choose wholeheartedly for David. If he had, he would have gone over to David's party, and he would not have been with his brother, with his father in the battle of the Philistines. So his residual dependence on the outworn state of being was what killed him. Now, I'm going into all this because this is all relevant to the way Jung perceives us who are about to read his book. And it corresponds to Jung's feeling feeling about his relation to the contemporary world to whom he was sending this book out. See, like David, he was all alone. About 7 months before he died, he wrote a letter to someone he didn't know, someone who would send him a book, Eugene Rolfe, in which he unburdened himself. And here's some of the things he had to say. I have to understand that I was unable to make the people see what I am after. I'm practically alone. There are a few who understand this and that, but almost nobody that sees the whole. I failed in my foremost task to open people's eyes to the fact that man has a soul and that there is a buried treasure in the field, and that our religion and philosophy is in a lamentable state. You see, Answer to Job is written out of that kind of lonely awareness. And he's aware that the readers of his book are at best perhaps in the same situation as Jonathan, namely caught in the old attitude, in a moment of crucial transition, not able to free themselves completely to go over to the new attitude, and still, like Jonathan, perish, still operating out of the standpoint of King Saul. Well, that letter hasn't been published, but Gerhard Adler published some excerpts of it, and it can be found in Psychological Perspectives, spring 1975, page 14. Now, turning to the substance of the lectori benevolent. It's really a quite wonderful exposition of the reality of the psyche. This, you know, is perhaps the basic theme of Jungian psychology. The reality of the psyche. And he starts right off by telling us that he's in danger of being torn to pieces by the two parties who were in mortal conflict about psychological matters. Either the psychological imagery is embedded in a metaphysical religious context and must be taken as concretely true, or the imagery is subjected to rationalistic, reductive criticism and interpreted away into nothing. It's what I call elsewhere the two fallacies, the concretistic or the reductive fallacies. And Jung says, if you're going to talk about these matters, you're going to be torn to pieces by the two parties who take these opposing positions. Whereas what he's offering is the third position. What he's dealing with are psychic truths. This is 2 or 3 pages here that are worth many rereadings, because the reality of the psyche is communicated just about as well as it's possible to do in words. However, I can't emphasize enough how difficult it is for all of us to realize the reality of the psyche, even though we talk about it all the time. And that's why Jung is so lonely. Intellectually, it's easy enough to grasp the idea, but to appreciate its living reality in our actual day-to-day life is quite another matter. An anecdote that Jung was fond of in describing this situation was this. He would try to impress on a patient the reality of a psychic matter, and he'd get just this bland, agreeable response, but that didn't register the full reality. And then he would say, "It's as though I told that fella that he has a rattlesnake in his pocket." And the man just smiles and says, "Oh, is that so?" That's the nature of the reality of the psyche, which when it dawns on you as real, then it's got the quality of a rattlesnake. Now, the reason we can't realize the reality of psyche is because it requires a higher level of conscious development than we yet possess. In my experience, after years and years of analysis, a few people, a very few, begin to get glimpses of it. But by and large, it's not something available for our time. By and large, it's a realization that's going to have to await future human development. And that's why Jung is so lonely. He quotes the church father, Tertullian, concerning the testimonies of the soul. I'm not going to read that over now, but I want to read a companion quote to it that also is a kind of testimony to the reality of the psyche. And this is a passage from the Gnostic Monoimus. This is quoted in a couple of places. You can find it, for instance, in Ion, in paragraph 347 of Ion. But it really points the way towards the realization of that rattlesnake. Here's what he says. He says, "Seek him, God, from within thyself, and learn who it is that takes possession of everything in thee, saying, my God, my spirit, my understanding, my soul, my body. And learn whence is sorrow and joy, and love and hate, and waking, though one would not, and sleeping, though one would not, and getting angry, though one would not, and falling in love, though one would not. And if you should closely investigate these things, you will find him in thyself, the one and the many, like that little point, for it is from thee that he hath his origin." So here's something to meditate on. Your thoughts, your feelings, your passions, your affects, they're not yours at all. You don't create them. It's only the child psyche that thinks those things are his. They come from an unknown source and flow through us. And as reality of the psyche begins to dawn, then the objective realization that those constituents of the psyche are not created by the ego at all. The ego just notices that they've arrived, so to speak. Then, continuing his remarks about the reality of the psyche, Jung makes an important statement. He says, statements made in the Holy Scriptures are also utterances of the soul. This should be the methodological basis for all that follows in answer to Job, because Jung is taking scriptural material and interpreting and understanding that material as the utterances of the soul, the manifestations of the objective psyche. And the basis for that conclusion is that scriptures achieve the designation of holiness or sacredness as a judgment of the consensus over a historical period of time, the consensus of humanity representing the collective psyche acknowledges their numinosity and establishes them as having sacred content, and thus marks them as being utterances of the soul. Then finally, he speaks about a dual standpoint towards the archetypal images, namely that they are both objects and subjects. That means that an archetypal image that we experience, we can study as an object, we can describe it, we can classify it, but at the same time, it's a subject. That means it's a separate personality. It's an interior personality that has something of the same subjective will and intention that encounter with an outer subject, an outer personality would have. And since the archetypal image has this double reference, then encounter with such a content will have a twofold effect. It will affect me, and I will affect it. So when the ego encounters the archetype is changed, and when the archetype encounters the ego is changed. There's that double reciprocal effect that goes on. Okay, turning now to our third category. I asked you to reread the book of Job in preparation for our study. Let me just remind you of the outline of the book of Job, the outline of the story. There's a wager in heaven between Satan and Yahweh as to whether or not Job can be turned away from God. Kind of the heavenly conspiracy. Job is then beset with multiple calamities. Job then questions his situation. Why is this happening to me? He calls out to God to explain to him why it's happening, to justify to him the reason for it. He says he's not an evil man, and his life and behavior does not, in justice, warrant this kind of treatment. Some counselors arrive on the scene who tell him in effect to quit the quit the questioning what's beyond him, and just let's submit and admit that even though you can't understand it, God is just. But Job refuses to do that. He perseveres in his questioning and in maintaining his integrity, as he puts it. And then finally, Yahweh manifests. He shows himself in the whirlwind and in a furious speech says, "Who are you to question me? Look at all my grandeur." And with that, Job is silenced and accepts the situation, and Yahweh then restores his property better than before. That's the bare bones of the biblical account. Now, this story is the prototype of what I call the Job archetype, which I think pictures a certain typical encounter between the ego and the self. And I distinguish four chief features to this so-called Job archetype of encounter. Number one, there's an encounter between the ego and the greater power. Number two, that a wound or a suffering of the ego results from the encounter. Number three, the ego perseveres in insisting on scrutinizing the experience in search of its meaning. It won't give up in despair or cynicism, but it perseveres in the assumption that the experience is meaningful. And we correspond to Jacob not releasing the angel he's wrestling with until he blesses him. And it corresponds to Job, who insists on thinking that he knows that his Redeemer lives, even though he's being mistreated. And then the fourth step is that as a result of that perseverance, a divine revelation takes place by which the ego is rewarded with insight into the nature of the transpersonal psyche. And it will be an insight that satisfies the ego. It answers the question in some form or another and brings acceptance. Now, this full sequence can take place only if it isn't short-circuited by a personalistic or reductive interpretation at step 2. You see, if Job were to submit to the advice of his counselors that he had it coming one way or another, and even though you can't understand why, admit that it's your just deserts. Then the short circuit would take place, and there would be no divine revelation. Now, this problem is illustrated by the dialogue that took place between Victor Wright and Jung that I refer to in Creation Consciousness. I want to read you a little bit of that dialogue because it's so very relevant to the issues that Answer to Job confront us with. Victor Wright wrote a review of Answer to Job, a negative review, quite a negative review. Let me read you a few passages. I can't read the whole thing. I don't have enough time, but give you the flavor. Is it profitable or even sensible to analyze a patient's gods without analyzing the patient, or without even a glance at his case history? Can it be irrelevant to all that follows? That is, as the opening verses of the book of Job tells us, Job is materially prosperous and spiritually complacent. That he turns aside or ignores evil. He's driving his children to drink. That he's anxiety-ridden with the suspicion that they precisely blaspheme. Can we treat the archetypal antics as autonomous, independently of Job's disturbed and anxious ego? And is it not symptomatic of the same split of ego from shadow, that as Job intensifies his repressions, his wife Anima is sick and tired of his infantile piety? I skip. What lesson as a pupil in psychology am I supposed to derive from it all? That we can legitimately transfer our personal splits and ills to our gods and archetypes and put the blame on them? Or are the critics right who consider that Jungians have become so possessed by the archetypes that they are in danger of abandoning elementary personal psychology altogether? Jung answered with this letter. Let us assume that Job is neurotic. He suffers from a regrettable lack of insight into his own dissociation. He undergoes an analysis of sort, for instance, by following Elihu's wise counsel. What he will hear and what he will be aware of are discarded contents of his personal subconscious mind. You faintly insinuate that I'm committing Elihu's error too, in appealing to archetypes first and omitting the shadow. One cannot avoid the shadow unless one remains neurotic. The shadow is the block which separates us most effectively from the divine voice. If Job succeeds in swallowing his shadow, he will be deeply ashamed of the things which happen. He will see that he has only to accuse himself, for it is his complacency, his righteousness, his literal mindedness, which have brought all the evil down upon him. He will certainly fall into an abyss of despair and inferiority feeling, followed, if he survives, by profound repentance. He will even doubt his mental sanity, that he, by his vanity, has caused such an emotional turmoil, even a delusion of divine interference. Obviously a case of megalomania. After such an analysis, he will be less inclined than ever before to think he has heard the voice of God, or has Freud, with all his experience, ever reached such a conclusion. If Job is to be considered as a neurotic and interpreted from the personalistic point of view, then he will end where psychoanalysis ends, namely in disillusionment and resignation, where its creator most emphatically ended too. Since I thought this outcome a bit unsatisfactory, and also empirically not quite justifiable, I have suggested the hypothesis of archetypes as an answer to the problem raised by the shadow. See, the problem raised by the shadow is that if one takes it all personally, one falls into the abyss because the shadow has an archetypal dimension to it. And if you have to take complete responsibility for the shadow, that amounts to a total demoralization. You can't do anything but commit suicide. Now these passages bring up a fundamental question I want you to reflect on. When dealing with psychic problems of various kinds in ourselves and in our patients, when is it proper to use a personalistic approach, and when is it proper to use an archetypal approach? In other words, when is the Job archetype truly constellated, and when can that symbolism be properly applied? That's a question I'd like you to reflect on, and perhaps some of you will have some comments and remarks, perhaps in the discussion or in the future, because it's basic to all our clinical work into our own individual personal analysis also.